Some people don't run from the noise because they hate the music. They run because they've forgotten what silence sounds like. John had everything the world told him to want: the stages, the crowds, the kind of fame that fills a room before you even walk into it. And yet, somewhere between the applause and the airport lounges, he lost the one thing no contract could replace: the feeling of being simply, quietly himself. So he came to Tuscany, to an old estate with olive trees that didn't care who he was, to learn, slowly, what it meant to belong somewhere. He wasn't looking for anyone, but Florence had other plans, and so did a small antique shop, a locked door, and a woman who recognized him instantly and chose, with perfect composure, not to say a word about it. This is a story about a man who found his silence, and the woman who made it sing.
A simple like helps this channel more than you know. So thank you for your support. I'm always curious to see where my listeners are from. Please drop a comment and share your location so I can see how far this story has traveled. Don't forget to subscribe, and now let's get back to the story.
The air in Florence hung heavy, with the scent of baking bread, fresh basil, and that particular perfume of old stone that had been drinking in sunlight for centuries. John stood outside a small, tucked-away restaurant on the Via dei Servi, still tasting the bitterness of a strong espresso on the back of his palate, watching the afternoon crowds move through the piazza, like water finding its level. "Thanks for lunch, man. I really needed this," said Marcos, clapping him on the shoulder. "See you in Los Angeles in a few weeks?" Mark mentioned you're already planning studio time. John felt a faint nausea at the mere mention of the studio, at the thought of particular quality of light in L.A., that flat, relentless glare that had nothing in common with Tuscan gold. But his face remained neutral, his expression unreadable behind the dark aviators. He pushed up onto the brim of his cap. He gave a single measured nod, allowing the assumption to settle between them, like a done deal. "We'll talk," he said, and nothing more. He watched Marcos disappear around the corner, then exhaled slowly. He was here, in the heart of the Renaissance, and it felt like a sin to rush back to this state. Just one short walk, he told himself. The bookshop was 2 streets away. You'll buy something, drink another coffee, and dissolve into the silence of your olive trees. But Florence was never completely quiet. He fell into step behind a cluster of students, trying to blend into the human current. He had pulled the cap low, turned up the collar of his jacket. The international uniform of a famous person who desperately didn't want to be famous for the next 20 minutes. It almost never worked. He felt the shift in the air before he heard the sound. A girl, no older than 20, had stopped dead in the middle of the street. Her phone was raised, but not toward the cathedral. She was staring directly at him. "Oh my God!" "John?" She breathed, and then, with the speed of a wildfire catching dry grass, the scream tore through the afternoon quiet. "That's John. John is here." He knew that sound in his marrow. He had learned, through long and painful experience, to recognize the precise acoustic signature of an avalanche beginning. There was no more time for a peaceful walk. He turned and ran into the first side street he could find, the sound of dozens of feet and high, ecstatic shrieking echoing behind him, promising everything except peace. The bell above the door, L'Antico Tesoro, did not simply ring. It gave a sort of panicked, indignant clatter as John crashed through it, slamming it shut behind him, and leaning against the wood with his full weight, gripping the handle as though holding a line. His chest heaved. Outside, the sound of running feet and shrieking voices swelled and then mercifully swept past. Inside, there was absolute stillness. The shop smelled of beeswax, old walnut, and some quiet, dignified past. Afternoon light fell in long golden bars across the furniture. Baroque commodes, Renaissance cabinets, an enormous gilded mirror that caught John's reflection and showed him, with brutal honesty, a man who looked like he had just escaped a very enthusiastic disaster. From behind a long wooden workbench, a woman slowly raised her eyes from the small inlaid box she had been polishing. She did not start. She did not reach for her phone. She simply removed her reading glasses, letting them hang on her fine chain against her chest, and studied a man pressed against her door with the calm, appraising gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating damaged things and seeing their potential. She was perhaps 26, 27, with a kind of unhurried beauty that had nothing to prove. Light brown hair, with sun-bleached streaks, fell loosely around her face. Her eyes, even at this distance, were an unusual shade, somewhere between gray and the pale blue of a winter sky. She wore no jewelry except small pearl earrings, and her expression held something John hadn't encountered in professional circles for years: genuine, uncurated composure. "Signore," she said in a low, unhurried Italian, "if you are looking for the emergency exit, you have come to the wrong place. But if you are looking for an 18th century Florentine commode, you are exactly where you need to be." John understood every word perfectly. He had been in Tuscany long enough for that. But in his current state of adrenalized panic, his Italian had apparently decided to take a brief holiday. He pulled off his sunglasses, wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, and looked at her, opting for a combination of languages and desperation. "Per favore," he started, then switched to English, his voice still ragged. "There's a stampede of teenage girls outside. I just need a moment before they figure out where I disappeared to." Arianna had already heard the muffled shrieking from the street. She looked at the man again. His pale blue eyes were filled with fatigue that went well beyond the last 5 minutes of running. It was the exhaustion of someone who had been running, in one way or another, for a very long time. Without a word, she set down her polishing cloth, walked to the door with unhurried steps, and turned the key in the lock with a soft, decisive click. "Come with me," she said, now in precise, accent-free English, and gestured toward the back of the shop. She led him into the workshop. This was where things were in the process of being reborn. Sunlight entered through a tall, north-facing window and fell across chairs being reupholstered in deep emerald velvet, a cabinet whose marquetry was being patiently reconstructed piece by piece. There was a small stool, a kettle, a shelf of well-thumbed reference books. It felt like the back room of someone's mind, organized, private, deeply inhabited. She brought him a glass of cold water, without being asked. "I presume Florence doesn't entirely agree with you when it sends a stampede of enchanted women in your direction," she said, leaning against a work table and crossing her arms, her tone neither mocking nor overly sympathetic, simply amused. John drank half the glass before answering. He sat down on the stool, feeling the adrenaline beginning to ebb. The room had a quality he couldn't immediately name, a steadiness, like sitting in the shade of something very old and very solid. "Florence is extraordinary," he said honestly. "I just sometimes forget that my face no longer belongs entirely to me." "You are safe here," she replied. "My clients are generally looking for things that are at least 200 years old. You are, I'm afraid, far too recent for their tastes." John laughed, a warm, slightly rough sound that seemed to surprise even him. It filled the small room differently than his usual, practiced laugh. "Thank you," he said. "Now, tell me, what's the fastest way from here to the parking lot by Lungarno della Zecchivecchia? My car is there, and I suspect the main streets are currently a no-go zone." They spent the next quarter of an hour in conversation that neither of them had planned. She told him about the restoration process of a Florentine commode, its hidden joinery, the particular yellow of its original gilding, the way a piece could carry 200 years of other people's lives and still look as though it had something to say. John found himself listening in a way he hadn't listened to anyone in a long time, without an agenda, without calculating what to say next. When the noise outside had completely subsided, she walked in front of the shop, checked the street with a quick, careful glance, and waved him forward. "All clear. The side door will take you directly into a lane that comes out near the river." "Thank you," he said, pausing on the threshold. He meant it for more than the escape route, and something in his tone made that clear. "You saved me from quite a lot." When he finally reached his car and sank into the driver's seat, he sat motionless for a moment, hand on the key, not yet starting the engine. The afternoon had already dissolved into a particular shade of bronze. He had not asked her name. The realization arrived like a small, clean sting. He could have asked. He could have found some natural way to introduce himself, though she had clearly already known who he was and chosen, with impressive self-possession, not to mention it. He could have asked for her number, for a coffee, for something. He glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror and gave a wry, self-deprecating half-smile. What exactly would he have said? Hello, I'm the man who always seems to come with a stampede. She probably had a life that made sense. He probably shouldn't complicate it. He started the engine and pulled out into the Florentine evening and told himself, firmly and not entirely convincingly, that some encounters were simply meant to be beautiful and brief. The road to her parents' house was lined with tall cypress trees that cast long, geometric shadows across the pale gravel. Arianna had always felt her shoulders drop the moment she turned off the main road onto the lane that led to the village. Not the gentle, picturesque sigh of a tourist discovering Tuscany, but the specific, involuntary release of a body returning to place where it first learned what safety felt like. She parked her old Vespa beside the stone house and caught, even before dismounting, the familiar layered scent, rosemary, fresh spring grass, and the warm ghost of pasta sauce that had been simmering for hours and had already spread to every corner of the kitchen. "Papa? Mama?" she called, pulling off her helmet and shaking out her hair, which had been slightly flattened by the journey. No answer came from inside, but from the pergola that faced the vineyard, she could hear the low murmur of voices. She crossed the courtyard, expecting to find her father with one of the neighbors, probably locked in their weekly disagreement about the price of olives or the timing of the next harvest. What she found instead stopped her where she stood, under the wooden beams of the pergola, half covered by the sprawling grapevine her grandfather had planted before she was born. Two men sat at the table. Her father, Matteo, in his faded work shirt, was gesticulating with his usual emphatic energy as he explained something. Beside him, bent over several vine leaves spread across the table and what looked like a viticultural handbook, sat a man Arianna recognized immediately and had absolutely not expected to find here. There was no cap, no dark glasses, no expression of harried celebrity. He was wearing a plain dark green cotton shirt, with the sleeves pushed his elbows, and a pair of jeans that had clearly seen genuine work. His blonde hair caught the late light. He looked, and this was a word that came to her before she could stop it, relaxed. Startlingly, disarmingly, attractively relaxed. "And if we don't treat this section of the slope before Tuesday, Matteo, I'm worried the powdery mildew will spread to the lower vines," he was saying, in Italian. That was slightly formal but entirely correct. "That's exactly what I've been saying, my friend." Matteo laughed, slapping the table. "But your estate manager is too cautious." He looked up and saw his daughter. "Arianna, come, meet our new neighbor. This is a man who actually understands the land, unlike those city friends of yours." John turned. The moment his eyes found hers, the warm, easy expression that had been on his face went absolutely still. Not frozen with displeasure. More like a man who has just been caught in the middle of a sentence by something that rendered him temporarily unable to continue. "You," he said in English, forgetting entirely about Matteo and Italian grammar. Arianna stood holding her helmet in one hand, trying to locate her voice. You're the neighbor my father has been talking about for months?" Matteo looked between them with the expression of a man who suspects he has missed something important. "Wait, do you two know each other?" "We met in the city," Arianna said quickly, aware of the warmth rising in her face. "I helped him find a Baroque commode." John rose slowly from the bench, and the grin that was beginning to spread across his face was precisely the kind of grin that made things more complicated. He turned back to Matteo with a small, formal bow that somehow managed to be both charming and self-mocking. "Actually," he corrected, in his careful Italian, "your daughter saved my life, Matteo. I simply failed to ask her name at the time." At that moment, the door of the house opened and Arianna's mother appeared, carrying a tray of coffee with particular expression of a woman who has been expecting everyone to stay for dinner since approximately noon. "Arianna, perfect timing. You're just in time for lunch," she said, setting the cups down with a decisive clink. Then turning to John, "And you must stay. I've already set a place." "You absolutely must," Matteo confirmed, adding his hand to John's shoulder. "Nobody in all of Tuscany makes fresh pasta like my wife. If you leave now, we will be genuinely offended." Arianna looked at her father, then at her mother, then at John. She tried, with some force of will and a single pointed look that she hoped communicated something along the lines of, "While I appreciate the gesture, This is not entirely necessary to discourage him. John caught the look, held it, and responded with a particular kind of slow smile that suggested he found the situation entertaining in a way he had no intention of abandoning. "Well," he said, his eyes not leaving hers, "given what's at stake, it would be terribly rude of me to refuse. I would be honored to stay. Thank you." Lunch unfolded in that specific, irreproducible register of noise that Italian families produce when they are at their most themselves. Several conversations happening simultaneously, hands in constant motion, wine poured without being asked, and the food itself a kind of argument about love. John ate with unself-conscious pleasure, clearing his plate of pasta and producing an expression of honest amazement at the flavor. That was clearly not politeness. "You know, Arianna," he said eventually, setting down his fork and leaning forward with a slight shift in tone, the shift of someone moving from the comfortable to the considered. "Your father has been invaluable about the land itself, but I have an idea that needs someone like you." She raised an eyebrow. "I want to build an online platform for the local producers. Your father's oil, Signora Connie's honey, the Bianchi family soap. I want the world to be able to find these things, but on terms that work for the people who make them, not for some corporation that will strip the story out of everything and leave only a logo." He paused. "The problem is that my Italian is... Let's say that I would probably accidentally offend half the village before we got as far as a website design." Matteo slapped the table with his palm. "Of course she'll help you. Arianna grew up here. She knows everyone. She speaks their language, and she's here nearly every weekend anyway. This is a perfect arrangement, isn't it, darling?" Arianna looked at her father, who was beaming, at her mother, who was already mentally planning celebratory dinners, and then at John, who had the grace to look faintly sheepish about the corner he had just very effectively maneuvered her into, while simultaneously making it clear in his eyes that the offer was entirely genuine. She thought about the idea. It was, in fact, exactly the kind of thing she had been quietly turning over in her own mind for years. The question of how the extraordinary, particular things made in these hills could reach the people who would love them without being swallowed by the machinery of mass commerce. "Fine," she said, and allowed herself a small smile. "I'll do it, on the condition that I have final say on the fonts and the photographs." "Done," John agreed, and his expression shifted into something warmer and less guarded than anything she had yet seen from him. "Come to the villa tomorrow, before you head back to Florence. I'll show you what I've built so far, and we can make a plan." The villa, Il Rifugio, the refuge, was indeed magnificent, though magnificently in a way that surprised her. She had half expected the ostentatious renovation that wealthy foreigners so often inflicted on Tuscan properties, everything stripped back and neutralized into expensive minimalism. Instead, the stone had been left to be stone. The wisteria growing over the south wall had not been cut back but trained. The terrace looked out over the valley through a frame of old olive trees, and the view was the kind that made you stop mid-sentence. They worked at a large wooden table on the terrace, his laptop open between them, paper spreading slowly outward as the afternoon progressed. The proximity was doing its quiet, insistent work. Each time their hands or arms came close, she was conscious of it in a way she didn't particularly welcome. A particular awareness that precedes something, like the change in air pressure before rain. "John," she asked at one point, pushing a strand of hair back from her face, and deciding to ask what she had been wondering since lunch. "Why are you doing all this? You could be anywhere in the world. Why Tuscany? Why an online shop selling soap and olive oil?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out over the hills where they faded into haze, and the sky became difficult to distinguish from the land. "In L.A., I had everything," he began, and his voice had dropped into a register she hadn't heard from him yet, slower, less performed. "The noise, the lights, the people who said yes before you'd finished asking the question. But I never had quiet. Everyone wanted a piece. My music, my face, my time, my energy. Every relationship felt like a transaction." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were direct in a way that was difficult to look away from. "When I bought this place, the first morning I woke up and went out to the vineyard before sunrise, I stood in the middle of the vines and realized the earth didn't care who I was. If I didn't water the olive trees, they would die, regardless of how many albums I'd sold. There was something about that, something necessary about that I hadn't known I needed. I found peace I didn't know existed, he continued. And I want to give something back to this community because they accepted me as a person, not as a brand. That's not something I take lightly. Arianna felt her defenses do something they hadn't done in quite a while. They shifted, not collapsed. She was not so naive as that, not after Roberto, but shifted like a door that had been closed for a long time, moving slightly on its hinges. Then we have a lot of work to do, she said quietly, and did not look away from him, while the jasmine from the garden below sent its sweetness up through the warm air, mixing with the smell of old paper and the faint, clean scent of him. The following Saturday, Arianna arrived at the village early. John was already waiting on the terrace when she came to the gate, 2 cups of coffee on the table, beside a basket of warm cornetti from the village bakery, a detail she noted with a part herself, that was paying closer attention than she wanted to admit. They spent the morning in the village. It was quickly apparent, if it hadn't been already, that Arianna was the reason doors opened. She had an unhurried, specific way of talking to people that John watched with something close to admiration. The way she sat with old Senior Giuseppe at his kitchen table and explained, with genuine respect, why his acacia honey should be findable by someone in Copenhagen or Chicago, and why that was not a betrayal the way it was made, but an extension of it. John stood slightly back, adding a careful sentence here and there in his formal Italian, letting his smile do the work his vocabulary couldn't. After a quick lunch at the villa, they continued through the afternoon, selecting photographs, arguing companionably about adjectives, working their way through a particular challenge of translating, not just language, but a quality of attention from one culture to another. The light shifted as Tuscan light does, from gold to amber to something that was almost red, painting the hills outside the window in shades of copper and plum. When John finally closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, the expression on his face was simple satisfaction. Not the performed triumph of a finished product, but the quieter pleasure of work done well, and done with someone whose company you've been glad of. I think we've earned a reward for today's diplomatic achievement with Giuseppe, he said, looking at her with undisguised warmth. Stay for dinner. Nothing elaborate, I promise. Tonight the estate manager cooks. An hour later, they sat on the stone terrace in the blue hour between sunset and dark. Between them was a wooden board of local cheeses, a bowl of pasta with fresh tomatoes, and an unlabeled bottle whose dark glass gave away nothing. I haven't opened this before, John said, filling her glass. Wine from this estate. My first harvest. Matteo and I watched it together last autumn. Arianna lifted the glass. It smelled of sun and dark soil and something patient. It's extraordinary, she said after the first sip, and meant it without reservation. It has strength, but it's somehow gentle. Like this place, John said, tilting his head back to look at the stars that were beginning to appear above them one by one, as though being introduced. You know, Arianna, for months after I came here, I couldn't even think about touching a piano. The thought of music hurt. It reminded me of everything I'd run from. He paused. The industry strips something out of you if you let it go on long enough. You stop knowing whether you love the thing itself or whether you just love that it makes people love you. The silence between them was a comfortable kind, the kind that only happens between people who have somehow, without quite meaning to, become easy with each other. And now, she asked. He rose without answering, disappeared into the house, and returned carrying a battered acoustic guitar, whose scratches and worn finish suggested a great many years and a great many rooms. He sat back down and held it, the way you hold something you have come back to after a long absence, carefully, with a kind of tentative reverence. Now I'm writing again, he said, but the songs are different. They're not written for stadiums. They're quieter, written for an ear that knows how to listen to wind and olive trees. He drew his fingers across the strings and produced a single soft, mournful chord that hung in the night air and then slowly, beautifully dissolved. No more shouting into the dark, he said. No more need to prove anything to anyone. Just a feeling that I'm finally, for the first time, home. He looked at her, and in the reflection of the emerging stars in her gray-blue eyes, he He saw something he had not been looking for and was now not certain he could do without. "You helped me understand that," he said. "The smell of that back room and the way you love these people, it became my new melody." Arianna felt a tightening in her throat. That was not sadness, but its near neighbor. A feeling too large and too sudden for the moment that contained it. She looked at him across the remains of their dinner, in the gathering dark, and understood that the careful distance she had been maintaining had closed, without her having noticed exactly when, to something very close indeed. 3 weeks passed in a version of life that Arianna found herself looking forward to with a specificity that she tried, with mixed success, not to examine too carefully. The platform was nearly ready for launch. Every product had its story. Every photograph had been chosen for what it held, rather than merely what it showed. She had started, without quite deciding to, spending more time on the estate than could be justified by work alone. That Sunday the plan was uncomplicated. She would stop at the villa to deliver the final producer contracts. They would have lunch on the terrace, and she would head back to Florence in the early afternoon. Simple, pleasantly anticipated. When she came through the gate, something was immediately wrong. In the space where John's dusty Land Rover usually sat, there was a red sports car, aggressively, almost offensively red against the soft gray-green of the olive trees. The villa's front door was ajar. Instead of music, she could hear from inside the sharp, rapid cadence of an argument in English. "John, be serious. You've been in this hole for 6 months." Came a voice she didn't recognize, loud, clipped, with the particular confidence of a man accustomed to being listened to. "The world doesn't wait. Fans start forgetting. I have appointments booked in L.A., producers asking for demo tracks. You can't play Farmer forever." Arianna stopped in the hallway. She pressed a folder of contracts against her chest. "Mark, I told you I need time," John's voice answered, and she heard in a tiredness she hadn't heard from him in weeks. "What I'm doing here matters. It's real." "Real? Selling honey and oil online is real?" A short, contemptuous laugh. "You're a rock star, not a village co-op administrator. This is a charming retirement hobby, John, but your life is where the 7-figure contracts are, where the stadiums are. Pack your bags. Our flight is Thursday. Your life is there. Pack your bags." The words hit Arianna with a physical precision she hadn't expected. The hallway disappeared, replaced, instantly, involuntarily, by the image of Roberto standing in her Florence apartment, holding a flight itinerary, saying, "I can't turn down an opportunity like this, Arianna. You have to understand." She stood very still for a moment, breathing with deliberate care. Then, quietly, moving like her own shadow, she walked through to the terrace and set the folder of contracts on the wooden table where they usually worked, beside his still warm coffee cup. She did not knock. She did not call his name. She turned and walked back to her Vespa, with the careful speed of someone trying to leave before they are seen. An hour later, when John had finally shown Mark to the gate with a promise to think about it, that was considerably less conciliatory than it sounded, he came back to the terrace and found the folder. His stomach dropped. He had completely forgotten, in the heat of the argument, in the particular way Mark always managed to make him forget everything except the argument, that Arianna was coming. He called 3 times. On the 4th attempt, he got her voicemail. A few minutes later, a message arrived. "John, I'm sorry I left without saying goodbye. There was an urgent call from the shop. The owner needs me in Florence tonight. An important client coming tomorrow morning. I have to prepare some pieces. I saw you had a guest and didn't want to interrupt. We'll speak soon." John read it twice. It was correct and professional and warm and completely airless. He recognized that register, had produced it himself more than once, when what he actually felt was something he didn't yet know how to say. He set the phone down on the table and looked toward Florence, where the hills in that direction had begun to turn particular violet gray of early dusk. Mark's voice was still in the room with him, overlapping with the jasmine and the vineyard silence, and for the first time since arriving in Tuscany, the peace felt fragile. 3 days passed. For Arianna, they were filled with the mechanical comfort of work, cataloging, polishing, researching provenance, answering the shop phone with professional brightness. That required some effort. She did not call him, Each time her phone vibrated, something in her chest lurched and then set its jaw. On Wednesday evening, as she was locking the heavy door of the shop, the cold river air moving up from the Arno, and carrying with it the smell of wet stone and distant rain, she turned to find him on the corner. No sports car, no entourage. John, in a dark leather jacket, hands in pockets, standing under the street lamp with the slightly tentative expression of a man who has thought carefully about whether this is a good idea and decided to do it anyway. "I knew you'd tell me you were busy if I called," he said, as she approached. "So I came to ask you in person. Will you have dinner with me?" They ate in a small, deliberately unfashionable place she knew near Santa Croce, where the wine was local and the candles were practical kind, rather than the atmospheric kind. The conversation was careful at first, the careful conversation of two people who are aware of something between them that neither has yet decided how to handle. When they walked back to her apartment, a small attic space in the Altrarno, with a view of the rooftops that was worth more than its square footage, the air between them had grown too dense for avoidance. "You didn't leave because of the shop, Arianna," he said, setting down his wine glass on her kitchen table with quiet finality. "You heard Mark." She moved to the window and stood with her back to him, looking at the lights of the city that was hers, its stone and its dust and its beautiful, complicated permanence. "I heard a man who came to take you back to your real life," she said. "I heard reality, John. You're on an extended holiday in Tuscany, and I live here. My world is made of stone and dust and permanence. Yours is made of lights and contracts and everything that follows you, even when you try to leave it behind." He crossed the room until he was standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, close enough that avoidance required a specific decision. "LA is my history, not my intention," he said. "Yes, I have obligations to deal with, things signed before I knew what a life without all this noise could feel like. But I have no intention of going back into that cage." His voice dropped. "My home is il rifugio. My home is the smell you carry in your hair from the workshop, and the particular way you look when you're talking someone into something they were always going to agree to." She turned then, because the silence demanded it. "Roberto said the same things," she said, and her voice, for the first time, had a tremor in it, slight and controlled. "But there, he loved Florence. He loved our life. He used to talk about staying forever. And then a better contract appeared, a connection to a cousin, a flight to America, and I became the thing that didn't fit in his suitcase." She met his eyes. "When I heard Mark, I heard the opening act of your leaving." John reached up and took her face gently in both hands, not pulling her toward him, just making the choice to be present to her. "I am not Roberto," he said. "I didn't come to Tuscany to escape. I came to find something. The process of releasing myself from the industry will take time. There will be pressure. There will be headlines I can't control. But I will not leave. And I will not allow my past life to make you feel like a stranger in my home again." It was not a matter of forgiveness. There was nothing to forgive. It was something slower and more difficult than that. The kind of conversation where two people sit with their fears in the open air between them and decide, carefully and without guarantees, to trust anyway. They spoke until the city outside the window had grown entirely still. And by the time Arianna finally fell silent and accepted the truth he was offering her, the first pale gray of pre-dawn was beginning to accumulate at the edges of the sky. When she finally slept, her head on his shoulder, he lay awake for a long time with his hand in her hair, watching the light change over Florentine rooftops, and felt something had been in the process of building for months settle quietly and completely into place. The following Saturday came in warm and still, the sky over Tuscany the deep, uncomplicated blue of high summer. John should have felt good. Mark had left on Thursday in a state of barely contained professional outrage. The platform was nearly launched. The estate was quietly thriving. He had, for the first time in years, a person in his life whose presence made the world feel correctly proportioned. What he felt instead was a low, anticipatory dread, which he attributed to the fact that Lydia had arrived on Friday. He hadn't been entirely surprised. It had Mark's fingerprints all over it, the timing, the method, the barely veiled logic. Lydia had called, distressed, saying she needed to get away, and the word he'd had from a mutual friend suggested she was having a genuinely difficult time. the particular kind of crisis that arrives when the life you constructed around being perceived a certain way begins to show its structural problems. He had put her in the guest cottage. He had made her tea. He had done what a decade of complicated friendship required, while knowing with quiet certainty that Mark had facilitated the visit as what he would call a reminder of what you're leaving behind. Arianna arrived around noon, when she stepped into the living room carrying fresh bread and the kind of easy warmth that had become, over these weeks, something he actively looked forward to. She stopped. On the sofa, legs crossed, wearing a silk robe that was several registers too intimate for a Saturday afternoon's uninvited house guest, sat a woman whose face had appeared on enough magazine covers to be recognizable without introduction. She looked up from her phone with the careful, measured attention of someone who has never not been in a room center. "Oh," said Lydia, with a studied pleasantness that was doing a great deal of work. "You must be the assistant John mentioned. You brought bread. How lovely. Just set it over there, will you?" The precise calibration of the insult, the assistant, was not accidental. John walked in from the kitchen at that moment when he saw the two of them in the same room. He felt the specific sensation of two separate worlds colliding in a way that produces neither a satisfying crash nor a clean resolution, only a kind of helpless, awful recognition. "Arianna, you're early." "It seemed so," she said. Her voice was completely level. She set the bread on the table with a careful, unhurried movement. "I can see you have company. I wasn't aware your old obligations had taken on a physical form." He moved toward her. "It's not what it looks like. Lydia is going through a difficult—" "I know that look, John," she interrupted, and for a moment she glanced at Lydia, who was watching the scene with an expression that contained, beneath the performance, something that might have been genuine sadness. "That is the look of a man who has left the door open into his old world. Roberto had exactly the same look. Always had to help everyone except the person he'd asked to trust him." She left without raising her voice, without tears, with the particular, terrible dignity of someone who has been here before and knows exactly how the architecture of this moment works. The room felt large after she'd gone. John turned to look at Lydia. She was watching him with an expression he hadn't seen from her in years, stripped of performance, of the careful curation, just a tired woman sitting in silk. "Lydia," he said, "you need to go. I love you as a friend. I will always pick up when you need me. But my life is no longer part of your story, and I am not part of whatever Mark had in mind when he suggested this. My home is here. The woman who just walked out is the reason I know that." Lydia was quiet for a long moment. Then something in her face shifted, like a mass adjusting, and what was underneath, it was more honest than he'd seen from her in a long time. "Mark thought I'd remind you of what you're giving up," she said. "But I look at you, and I can see you're not giving anything up. You found it." She paused. "Guard that, John. The industry despises people who are genuinely happy. Happy people write dreadful heartbreak songs." An hour later, after the taxi had taken her back toward Florence, John walked to Arianna's parents' house. He found her in the vineyard, moving between the rows with no particular purpose, pulling at dry leaves in a way that people do when they need their hands occupied, while their minds do the harder work. "She's gone," he said. He stopped a few feet from her and waited until she turned. "My failure wasn't her being here," he said. "My failure was not telling you the moment she arrived. I was afraid you'd misread it, and by staying silent, I confirmed exactly the fear I was trying to prevent." Arianna looked at him for a long, considered moment. Her eyes were dry and clear and full of pain he had put there. "The problem isn't her," she said. "The problem is that I don't always know where your kindness ends and your weakness toward that world begins." "Then watch me learn the difference," he said quietly, and there was nothing in his voice except steadiness. "I will show you, not once but every day, that I am here because I choose to be. I will not be perfect, but I will be present, and I will never again let anything from my past walk into our space and make you feel like a guest in it." The conversation that followed lasted until the light was gone from the sky. It was the kind of conversation that cost something. Honest, slow, neither of them performing, both of them staying in it. They emerged from it not unscathed, but closer, in the way that only happens when two people find the courage to stay in the room. Several days after Lydia's departure, The peace of Il Refugio was interrupted by a phone call. This time, Mark's voice had none of its previous aggression. It was measured professional and therefore more effective. Wembley, John. The Global Heart Concert. You agreed to this over a year ago, before you bought the Tuscany property. If you don't appear, it's not just your reputation you damage. It's a foundation that helps children who have nothing. You don't want to be the man who pulled out a charity concert in the final weeks because he decided to make wine. John was standing at the open window, watching Arianna below in the garden, deep in conversation with his housekeeper, laughing at something. His chest constricted. Mark was right. This was a commitment made in good faith to people who had nothing to do with the industry's endless appetite. He couldn't walk away from it, and he realized slowly he didn't want to. When Arianna came inside, she found him sitting at the piano, not playing, just looking at the keys. I need to go to London in 2 weeks, he said, not looking up. She stopped. The smile that had been on her face from the garden conversation faded, not dramatically, but with a careful, deliberate control that he recognized. Mark won, she said. No, he said, and stood and crossed to her. He took both her hands in his, and his grip was firm and warm and very present. This is a concert I committed to long before any of this. It's a charity event. I can't cancel it, and I wouldn't if I could. The cause is real, but I want you to come with me. He paused. I want you to see who I am when I'm doing the thing I love. I want you to see that the man on that stage and the man who makes wine with your father, it's the same person. And I want, in front of every person in that building, to show them exactly where my heart is. Arianna pulled back slightly, not out of rejection, but from the habit of self-protection. That's not my world, John. I don't know how to be in a room full of lights and cameras, and people whose job is to look at you. What would I even do there? You would be there, he said simply. That's the whole of it. I want to close this chapter of my life with you in the room. I want you to stop seeing London as the beginning of my departure and start seeing it as my last obligation to the person I used to be. There was a long silence. Outside, the wind moved through the olive trees. All right, she said at last. I'll go, but you have to promise me one thing, that you won't leave me alone with those people. I promise, he said and pulled her in. You will be next to me, and on that stadium stage, in front of 80,000 people, the only person I will see is you. London received them the way John's old life always received its returning heroes. Loudly, without breathing space, with a wall of cameras at the private terminal that flickered in the rhythm of her heartbeat. In the limousine moving through gray streets toward the hotel, there was a quiet. John held her hand with one of his, firmly and without drama, while the other worked steadily through a stream of messages. The transformation was subtle, and therefore more unsettling than a dramatic one would have been. He was still John, unmistakably John, but with something overlaid, a sharpness, a professional readiness, a charisma that had been turned up to a setting that Florence and Tuscany never required. Are you all right? He asked, noticing her silence. I just need a moment to adjust to this many eyes, she said honestly. In Tuscany, the only things watching me are your olive trees and the occasional curious neighbor. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her palm. Stay with me. None of this can reach you unless you let it. The hotel was a sophisticated kind of chaos. Every step through the lobby was choreographed whether they liked it or not. The suite filled and emptied at intervals. Stylist Mark, radiating the quiet triumph of a man who has successfully herded his most valuable asset back into the arena. Assistants, 2 security consultants comparing earpieces. John kept his promise. To everyone who entered, from the event director to the person whose sole responsibility appeared to be delivering specific coffee, he introduced her with the same phrase, the same tone. This is Arianna, my girlfriend. Not his assistant, not his friend, not a compromise. She stayed beside him, and he kept turning back to her, checking, including her, refusing to let the room deposit her in a corner. But despite his effort, she felt the cold not forming. She watched him move through the room, at ease in the language of this world, as she was at ease in the language of her own. He solved a technical problem in the set list with quick authority. He laughed with colleagues with particular ease of long shared history, and in his eyes, unmistakably, There was a light that Tuscany had not put there, the specific electricity of performance, of expectation, of an audience waiting. "You're afraid I'll realize I missed this," he said that evening, when they were finally alone, the London lights sparkling in the windows. Arianna sat on the edge of the bed, arms around herself. "I'm not afraid you'll miss it, John. I can see that you do miss it. Some of it. I'm afraid you'll realize that Italy was your way of recovering, and that this," she gestured at the lights, "the city, the whole enormous apparatus, is what actually defines you." He crossed to her and knelt, so that they were eye level, and pushed the hair back from her face, with a gentleness that was in complete contrast with the electric room they had spent the day in. "Music defines me," he said. "That's true, but this circus around it, that's just noise. Tomorrow night, you'll see the difference. Tomorrow night, I'm going to show you that all of this, every bit of this enormous, exhausting, magnificent thing, I need it only because it lets me say to you, in front of everyone, what I whisper to you every night in Italy. Trust me, please." She gave a small nod, but lying beside him later in the vast hotel room, listening to the London sirens below, she wondered whether one concert could be large enough to defeat a fear that had been quietly accumulating for years. Wembley was not a stadium that evening so much as a living organism, 80,000 people breathing together, pulsing with a collective anticipation that had its own weather system. Arianna stood in the wings, in the specific darkness that exists just at the edge of the stage lights, wearing a lanyard that gave her access to this exact improbable spot. She had a pair of ear defenders around her neck, more for the psychological reassurance than any practical use. John was 5 meters from her, but the distance between them felt like geography. He stood with his guitar, talking quietly with the bassist, and the transformation she had glimpsed in the hotel was now complete. He wasn't just John. He was something the crowd had been building toward for months without his presence, a shape that all that expectation was about to fill. When he walked out, the sound from 80,000 mouths hit her body before it reached her ears. She reached, instinctively, for the wall. This is the man who sits on his terrace and argues about the typography on a honey jar label, she thought, and immediately understood why that contrast was not reassuring. Mark appeared beside her as the opening chords of the first song rolled across the stadium like a warm front. "Look at him," Mark said, his voice carrying that particular quality of warmth that functions as a delivery mechanism for something colder. "He was born for this. That light in his eyes." She said nothing, kept her eyes on the stage. "I mean it sincerely. Thank you," Mark continued, turning to her with a smile she now recognized. "You genuinely helped him find his way back here. He needed that break, that time in Italy, those months of breathing. It brought him back to where he belongs. Without you, I'm not sure we ever would have gotten him on this stage again." The words entered quietly and arranged themselves with precision. "Without you, he's back where he belongs." She felt the heat behind her eyes that she refused to give permission. She watched John move across the stage, watched how the crowd moved in response to him like a tide, watched how completely he occupied the space, and felt for the first time since the pergola at her parents' house the cold, specific doubt. Who was she in relation to all this? What did a small Florence antique shop, and a Vespa, and a regional wine offer next to this? John finished the song. The stadium became briefly insane with noise. He was shining with sweat and exertion, and something close to pure joy. He looked immediately toward the wings, searching the darkness for her eyes. Arianna took a step back, deeper into the shadow behind the curtain. She felt like a trespasser in the story of her own life. After the second song, another thundering anthem that seemed to make the concrete vibrate, John turned to the band and gave a signal that required no explanation. The drums stopped. The bass fell away. The crowd, sensing a change in register, began its transition from roar to murmur to something approaching silence. 80,000 people collectively adjusting to the possibility of something different. He walked to the microphone stand. The lighting rig above him shifted, the electric blues and yellows of performance bleeding away until only a single white spot remained, isolating him from the darkness. He was sweat-damp, loose-shouldered, and completely still. "Thank you," he said into microphone, and his voice, in the sudden quiet of the enormous space, had the quality of a private confession made public. For many years, the most important relationship in my life was this one. With you through music. That energy sustained me through things I won't describe on this particular stage. He exchanged the electric guitar for the acoustic, the same battered instrument he had carried out to the Tuscan terrace. On the evening of the first harvest wine, the silence deepened. But I've come to understand that the music was always a road that led me somewhere specific, to a place, to a person. In the wings, Arianna had gone completely still. Mark's smile had stalled. This song wasn't written for the charts. John continued, his eyes moving to part of the wing where he knew, from long familiarity with stage geometry, that she was standing. He couldn't see her in the darkness. He spoke to it anyway. It was written in an olive grove, before anyone was awake. It belongs to a woman with gray-blue eyes, who let a panicked stranger hide in her back room, without asking a single question, who taught me what it looks like to love something, a place, a craft, a community, without needing anything from in return. The first chord was the same one that had trembled across the Tuscan night air, when the stars were coming out and the jasmine was loud. His voice was stripped of its concert precision, raw, unhurried, free of technical management. He sang about the smell of beeswax and old wood, about dust moving in slanted afternoon light, about the peace that arrives not as an event but as a slow accumulation, like the light changing on green hills, about waking up and finding that the noise you had mistaken for yourself had, while you were sleeping, become something you no longer needed. 80,000 people stood in complete silence, no phones raised, no movement, the particular quality of attention that only arrives when a crowd understands it is in the presence of something real rather than something performed. When he reached the final lines, all the lights of this world are only shadows of what I see when I look at you, he turned his body toward the wing. Arianna stepped out of the shadow. She was not performing composure anymore. The tears on her face were not the tears of fear or uncertainty. They were the tears of a woman who had been holding something very tight for a very long time and has just been given permission, in front of 80,000 witnesses, to let it go. She understood. Wembley was not evidence that he belonged to this world. It was his farewell to it, or rather his negotiation with it, acknowledging what it had given him and then, in front of every person that had ever drawn to his name, placing it in its proper proportion. He played the last note and let it dissolve in the air above the stadium. He didn't bow. He didn't address the crowd. He simply lowered the guitar, and his eyes, searching, then finding, then holding, said to her the only thing that had ever needed to be said. I chose you. The morning in London was gray and raining, with the apologetic persistence of an English summer, but inside the hotel suite, the atmosphere was unusually clear. Mark sat across the table from John with the expression of a man who has spent the night recalibrating. The concert had generated more press attention than anything John had done in 3 years, not for the technical performance, but for the song, for the gesture, for what everyone who had been there described as the most unguarded thing they had seen on a stage of that size. So, Mark said, closing his folder, Tuscan album, released in autumn, no world tour, no mandatory talk show circuit. He paused. You're serious about this? The album is a yes, John said. The rest, we discuss on a case-by-case basis. Charitable concerts, yes. One-off performances that mean something, yes. A 2-year global tour that takes me away from the state during harvest season and puts me in hotel rooms from here to Auckland, no. That chapter is closed. Mark was quiet. Outside, the rain moved across the window in shifting curtains. You know what the industry is going to say, Mark said finally. The industry will say whatever it needs to say, John replied. I've spent more than a decade worrying about what the industry was going to say. I'd like to spend the next 10 years making things, family, wine, music, and being present in my own life. Another silence. Then Mark put out his hand. You know what, John? You're the first person I've worked with in 20 years who doesn't look like they're one bad review away from coming apart entirely. A short laugh that was, for once, genuine. Good luck to you. And look after her. She watched that last song without blinking. That's a woman who knows what things are worth. Several months later, a new shop appeared on a quiet street in the Oltrarno district of Florence. The sign in fine forged iron lettering that suggested both quality and permanence read, Lanico Refugio. Arianna stood in the center of her shop, in the smell of fresh polish and beeswax that was already, after only a week, beginning to feel like hers. Every piece in the room had passed through her hands. The light fell exactly as she had planned it. The sign outside was the one she had sketched on the back of a platform contract document, while they were arguing about color palettes one evening on the terrace. John appeared in the doorway carrying the last box of books, slightly out of breath, grinning. "You know," he said, setting the box down and wrapping his arms around her from behind, "I genuinely think this Baroque commode would look extraordinary beside your desk." He said it with a specific tone of a callback that was also an admission. This is where it started, and look where we are. You are impossible. Arianna laughed and leaned back against him. But honestly, he said, and his voice changed register. Quieter, the grin becoming something warmer. Thank you for letting me help you believe that you could have both. A life that was entirely your own and a person in it. We have our world, she said, tilting her head back to look at him. This is just one room in it. The album had come out the previous autumn with no fanfare that John had personally arranged. There had been no stadium tour announcement, no late-night television appearances, no choreographed rollout, just the music. 12 acoustic tracks recorded mostly at Il Refugio, several of them in the same room, where Arianna had first spread her platform contracts across the wooden table. The industry had not known what to make of it. It sounded like nothing he had released before. No production sheen, no anthemic choruses built for arenas, no attempt to be enormous. Critics had reached, somewhat helplessly, for words like intimate and unguarded. What they meant, though none of them said it quite this directly, was that it sounded like a man telling the truth. The public, as it sometimes does when given the chance, recognized that immediately. By January, it had outsold everything else he had ever made. By August, the noise had settled. The reviews had been filed. The streaming numbers had plateaued at something extraordinary, and the world had moved on to its next fascination, leaving John and Arianna in the warm, cricket-loud quiet of a Tuscan evening that smelled of dry earth and rosemary and particular sweetness of ripe grapes, just beginning to give under their own weight. The air had that late summer density to it, soft and heavy at the same time, the kind that makes you speak more slowly and breathe more deeply without quite deciding to. John and Arianna walked slowly between the rows. He had stopped speaking mid-sentence and turned to her, placing his hands gently on the swell of her abdomen, which was now clearly, unmistakably, beautifully present beneath the light fabric of her dress. Beneath his palms, he felt a movement, faint, exploratory, the particular small shock of a life that has not yet arrived but is already unmistakably here. The expression on his face was not one he had ever produced for a camera. "I used to believe," he said quietly, the way you say things when you're talking to someone who is also a little bit listening to the evening, "that I would never find this. I thought the price of the life I'd chosen was exactly that, the ordinary, specific, irreplaceable things. I made my peace with that. And then the earth moved, as the earth apparently has a habit of doing in Tuscany. And here we are." Arianna covered his hands with hers. The hills in the distance were going dark at their edges, the way they do just before the light fully goes. "We didn't just find a new life," she said. "We found each other in the places where we were most ourselves. You in your vineyard, counting your losses and your olives. Me in my back room, taking broken things apart to see how they worked." He kissed her then, long and unhurried, the way you kiss someone when you're not trying to convey urgency or persuade anyone of anything, but simply to mark a moment that deserves to be marked. No stadiums were required. The music was still there, threading through everything, through the rhythm of her breathing and the sound of the vines moving in the late breeze and the small, persistent, magnificent fact of the life beneath his hands. It was quieter now than it had ever been. And for exactly that reason, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. The Song of the Olive Grove had found its final, best verse.
Thank you so much for listening. If you loved this story, please share it with a friend or leave a like to support the channel. Don't forget to subscribe for your weekly dose of original audio romance. I'm Elena Maris, and I'll see you in the next story.